Good afternoon or good morning, depending on what time zone you're in. This is the year 3 call, the training on using the Record Review Worksheet. I still see a lot of folks pouring in, so we're going to wait another minute or so before we start. But thank you again for joining us, and we will look forward to getting started in a moment.
All right, hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm sorry, I think I got some messages that there were some sound issues. If you can hear me, please raise your hand. Hooray, okay, I'm sorry about that. Not quite sure what happened, but Seems to be okay now. All right, sorry about that. Just to backtrack for a moment, this is, again, the Year 3 Record Review Worksheet training. All of you are on this call because you have either recently started your reviews or you haven't quite gotten started yet. So we thought we would hold this training so that folks can see a live demonstration of how the worksheets are completed. So with me on today's call is Lee. Again, this is Katie Watts. I am the error rate lead with the National Center on Subsidy Innovation and Accountability. And with me is Leanne Bryan and Janae Broadway, also from the Subsidy Center. They are error rate specialists. Leanne is the Program Integrity Manager for the Subsidy Center, and they will be here to help with the questions as they come in. Also, we have Shelley Dilks and Linda Winings from the Office of Child Care Central Office. Okay, so some logistical items. If you were registered for the webinar as of this morning, you should have gotten an email with the slides as well as a blank record review worksheet. On this slide, it says blank record review worksheets, plural. There's only one. That's just a typo. If you did not get that email, it should be available in the handouts box on GoToWebinar. The webinar will be recorded. If you would like a copy following the webinar, please send me an email. My address is right here, kwatts@wrma.com. And you can also contact me with any follow-up questions or concerns. If you happen to have any technical issues during the webinar, if you can't access the handouts or anything else is going on, send an email to Janae Broadway, jbroadway@wrma.com. And she will try and get that sorted. Okay, so again, the purpose of today's webinar is to help all of you out with completing your record review worksheets for your error rate case reviews. We have discovered some issues, mostly minor, but issues nonetheless, with states on completing the record review worksheets. Things like coding, completing columns 2 versus 3, using the missing and insufficient documentation table. So I wanted to address these issues on this call, so hopefully it can help you as you get started with your reviews. During this webinar, we will not be discussing customization of the record review worksheet. That shouldn't be an issue with any of you, since I think all of your worksheets have been submitted already. However, since I know some of you are kind of new to this process, you might be a reviewer who hasn't worked on this before, I wanted to take a moment just to give some background and overview of how the record review worksheet is used. So as you can see here, the record review worksheet, or RRW, it's a standardized format to assess child care case records, to determine whether child care eligibility was correctly determined and whether the correct subsidy payment is made. And this is used again for our federal CCDF error rate review process. Each state customizes portions of the record review worksheet to conform to your own CCDF program policies and procedures. The record review worksheet consists of 5 sections. Let me just pull up really quickly. So here's an example of a section, section 1, and section 2 down here. And each of these sections are further divided into elements. So there are 11 elements. These rows that you see here, each represent one element. They're numbered like element 100, 200, and so on. oops, sorry about that. Elements 100 through 410 each have 4 columns. And you can see here, there's column 1, elements of eligibility and payment determination, and then columns 2, 3, and 4. Element 500 only has 2 columns, but we'll see that in a few minutes as we're going through an example. The record review worksheet also consists of a missing or insufficient documentation table or mid-table. If you've been involved in this process in the past, the mid-table is something new. So we'll look at a couple examples of that. For each case review, the reviewers are looking at a couple of things, and we'll be doing a couple things. First, the reviewers complete the case information on the top of the worksheet, which is right here, child ID, state, county, and so on. Reviewers complete columns 2, 3, and 4 of each element, 100 through 410. Complete both columns in element 500. And if applicable, complete the mid-table. All right, so this is how this webinar will work. It's a bit different from some of the other webinars that you might have been involved with the error rate review. But I have, again, a few examples of record review worksheets. We're going to start with case review example 1, and we're going to go through this element by element. Now, if you have that Word document, the example record review worksheet that I sent out this morning, and you plan on following along, filling it in, writing notes, this would be a good example to use that record review worksheet because we will be going through it in detail. Case examples 2 and 3, we're going to go through a bit more quickly, just focusing on the error elements. So again, if you have some blank or have that Word document printed out, you probably will not be using that for those, just because we're going to be going through those a little bit more quickly. And then, time permitting, I'd like to do a 4th example that will be a bit more interactive. We'll be looking for some participant input, and I'll describe that a bit more when we get there. If you have any questions, please raise your hand or use the question box. We'll stop throughout to address questions as they come in. So without further ado, we're going to start with our first case example, our first worksheet example on element 100. Now you can see here that this is an example, kind of a mock record review worksheet that I've written up. I've customized columns 1 and 2. Your record review worksheets for your own states will look different, of course, since you customize them for your own programs. So just keep that in mind that this is, the customization that you see here is just an example. Starting with column 1, you don't do anything in column 1, you leave that blank. This just shows the policy citations. But moving over into column 2, in this in this example, we had an application that was complete with a signature. The child care agreement form was complete. Proof of assets were given to DHS. However, there is an error in this element. The application was not processed within 15 business days or 45 days for TANF applications. And in this particular state, this is considered an error. Now, again, I cannot stress this enough that this is just an example. In your states, this might not be considered an error. It might be considered a payment error, might not be considered an error at all. This is, just in our pretend state. The comment section in column 2 can be used for a couple of things. We often say that this is where we show our work. In some elements where there might be math needed, you can, do your math here. You can describe the documentation that was reviewed, or you can just kind of build upon, explain why you checked certain boxes. So in this example, I use a sentence to just describe what the error was. The application was not processed within the 15 business days, but the application and the agreement form were included in the case file. So from reading this, you have a clear idea of what the error is. Column 3 is the findings, and this is where we have a summary of what was found in this element. We don't present any new information in column 3. We say that it was an error because the application was not processed within 15 business days. I do say that it was an administrative error, which means that it's not a payment error. Moving over to column 4, the coding, I code 1 for an error and N because the error was not the result of missing or insufficient documentation. 2A is only coded if there is a mid-error. So in this case, we have an N for number 2. It was not a mid-error. The error was not caused by missing or insufficient documentation. So we can just go ahead and leave 2A blank. There will be some examples later in this presentation that show 2A being coded. All right, so in this case example, now we have an error in element 100. Moving on to element 200. I'm making 200 pretty easy on us. As in probably some of your states, this error is not really this element is not really applicable because the state served all eligible children during the sample month. However, we're still going to fill out column 3, no error, and we still need to code column 4. We code a 0 for no error and NA because there was no error. So number 2 in column 4 is always coded as Y, N, or NA. And again, we can skip 2A. Moving on to element 300. 300 is where we look at whether the client who's applying for child care assistant meets the definition of parent or step-parent, guardian, etc. Here we just have one question, whether the client meets the policy definition, one checkbox, yes or no. And then a question, what definition does the client meet, parent? And here we're going to use the comment section to describe what documentation was reviewed and also give a little bit more information about what was discovered here. So we have a single parent household with 2 children. We reviewed the birth certificate. If there had been an error here, you can use this comments box to describe what was missing, how you determined that there was an error. Okay, so I got a question that came in, a good question. Is it mandatory to place no error in the findings? So that's a good question. And the answer is, if there is no error, yes, we do want to see that represented in column 3. So you can say, no error, element has no error, just something along those lines. But you should not leave column 3 blank. Paige, does that answer your question? I see you have your hand raised as well. So if you want to just quick, oh, okay, it does answer your question. Great. All right, thank you. Okay. And then of course coding, 0 for no error. NA because, again, there's no error. All right, and in this example, 310 is pretty similar. We have a checkbox for yes or no. Again, your state's record review worksheet probably looks different than this. But we're going to fill in the box for yes, and using that comments box to describe what documentation was present. And again, no error, and column 4 is coded as having no error. All right, element 320 is parental work training status. So this is the element where we determine if the parent met the need for service, whether it be working or something else. So the parent met the need for service due to employment. And often we see, we like to see it addressed if there's a 2-parent family in this element. A lot of states will have a question about, second parent, or it's something that's addressed in the comments. In our example, there is a question here for if there's a 2-parent family, does the second parent meet the need for service? This is not applicable since this is a single-parent household. So again, just being thorough and, filling in all of the boxes, all of the questions, unless it, really is not applicable here. I'm using the comments box here to expand a bit on the questions. So just making a note that the client is employed and they work 35 hours per week. Okay, I have actually another question that came in, so I'm going to go back really quick to element 320. The question is that, so let's see, to clarify on element 310, Nebraska has been putting the client resided in Omaha, Nebraska at the time of payment. Is this sufficient? The only thing that I would say for this page, and we can certainly follow up after the webinar if you have other questions on this, because I'm just going to answer really briefly. So what we're looking at here is the time of the eligibility determination, not necessarily the time of payment. Okay, so what you want to put down here is that the client resided in Omaha at the time of the eligibility determination. Because again, this is a review about whether eligibility was determined correctly. And again, if you have other questions on this, we can definitely follow up after the webinar, but hopefully that helps. This is a review again about whether correct eligibility was determined. And we really only look at the payment towards the end of this. Okay. So column 3, no error, but that's a good question. Column 4, no error and not due to missing or insufficient documentation. Element 330 is qualifying child. We're going to say that this child was 3 years old. And the next question only applies if the child is between 13 and 18. So we're going to check not applicable for that. Documentation of citizenship, yes. And we're going to use the comments to describe, again, what the documentation was here. The reviewer looked at the child birth certificate. And columns 3 and 4 are just filled out like we have for the past couple of elements. No error, 0 for column 4, number 1, and not applicable for number 2. Element 340 is qualifying care. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this one because this is an area where there's a bit of difference between last cycle and this cycle. So if you've been involved in this before, Element 340 now includes provider payment rate, whereas that used to be included in element 400. So I wanted to show an example of an error for provider payment rate. So the first item we have here is type of care authorized. Yes, the correct type of care was authorized. The next question is, was the correct provider payment rate authorized? And we're going to say no for that. And we're going to use the comment section to describe what the error was. The part-time rate of $60 was assigned due to a system error. This should have been the full-time rate. So again, the correct type of care was authorized, but the incorrect provider payment rate was authorized. In the findings column, the reviewer has written that there is an error due to the wrong payment rate assigned. And in column 4, we'll code 1 because there's an error. In N, because the error was not due to missing or insufficient documentation. And we'll leave 2A blank. Again, that's only completed if we had a Y in number 2. All right, moving on to element 350. This is the element where you'll determine what type of provider was used and if the provider met all of the requirements. So in this case, a family child care provider is used. And yes, the provider met all applicable policy requirements. And in here, the comment section is just saying that the provider, met the requirements. We do like to see, the comments boxes used liberally. It's always good to include more there than less. You might find that, there's an element where there's really nothing to say in the comments, and that's perfectly fine. So, in these examples, I am filling out something for most of the comment boxes, but again, don't feel like you have to have something in there if there really genuinely is nothing to say. But we do want to see column 3 have something in there for each element. In this case, there's no error. And column 4 is coded as such. All right, so let's move on to 400, the biggie, where we look at the families, whether they met the financial requirements, the income requirements. So in our example, we have a number of questions here. First, was all of the income documentation included in the case file? Yes. We have the total family income, a family size of 3. Yes, the family met the income threshold. And then there's a couple of questions here about the family copay. So a $40 parent fee was assigned, and it was the correct copay. All right, so the comments box in 400, a lot of times we see some math here. If the family has, multiple sources of income, or if the reviewer wants to add up, the pay stubs to figure out the income, that's all great use of column 2 comment box. In our example, I didn't put a lot of math in here. I just mentioned the documentation that was reviewed, pay stubs. The monthly wages were $26.60. And I mentioned that the reviewer's calculation matches the eligibility workers. So again, all of the income appears to be correct. No error. And column 4 is coded as such. So element 410 is where we determine if the subsidy amount as determined by the eligibility worker matches the reviewer subsidy amount. And if there's a difference, was an improper payment made. Now, again, this is an area where there's a little bit of difference from last cycle if you were involved 3 years ago. This used to be the case summary as well as the element in which we determine improper payment. Now it's just about the subsidy amount and the payment. It's no longer the case summary. So in our example, if you recall, going back to element 340, there was a discrepancy between the payment rate that was assigned and what should have been assigned. So the eligibility worker subsidy amount was 92. The reviewer determined that it should have been more than that for a difference of $253. The next item is sample month payment amount, if applicable. And I say if applicable because we don't really look at the payment amount here in column 2 unless there was a discrepancy. So the payment amount was $92. All right, so I have a ton of words here in column 2. I did some math here. I won't, go through it in detail, but basically what I did was I determined, what the rate should have been, how that, comes out to the monthly rate, and then subtracting the copay, basically doing the math for what the subsidy amount was and what it should have been. So a lot of times in this column 2 of 410, this is what we see is just that math for figuring out what the subsidy amount was. In the findings column, column 3, I note that there was an underpayment of $253 found. So this was an error. And again, since this error was caused by the payment rate, it was not caused by missing or insufficient documentation. Now in element 410, column 4, there's no 2A. It just stops at 2. All right. So this is the missing or insufficient documentation table, and I've included it here since it is a part of the Record Review Worksheet template. It is not customized. It looks the same for each, across states. This particular example did not have a missing or insufficient documentation error causing an improper payment or potentially causing an improper payment. So we're going to leave this blank. But I just wanted to show you this for completeness sake, since it is part of the template. So we'll now move on to the case summary, which is element 500. This is something, again, that is new in the Record Review Worksheet this cycle. Element 500, the case summary, column 1 is where we write out a narrative version of the case summary. So in here, you would mention what errors were found, cite what elements had the errors, and mention if there was an improper payment. So in this example, remember we had 2 elements that had errors, plus 410 had an error as well. The first error was in element 100. There was an administrative error due to the application not being processed in time. And there was also an underpayment due to the wrong provider payment rate being applied. And elements 340 and 410 are cited here. 340 is where that error was found, and 410 is where we discovered the improper payment amount. So those are both cited here. If this case would have had no errors, then again, in the case summary, you could just write that, no errors found. Moving over to column 2, coding, there's a lot of things here to fill out. 1 is no error or error, so we're going to code 1 because this case did have an error. If there were no errors, it would be 0. The error was not caused by missing or insufficient documentation. Items 2A through 2B are, 2A through 2E are only filled out if the mid-table was used. And actually, let me backtrack. They are filled out, but it's all going to be 0. All right, so again, I misspoke there. I'm sorry. They do need to be filled out, but if the mid-table was not used, it's just going to be zeros down the line. And I think our next example does have the mid-table, so I'll show you then, how that's completed. All right, moving on to item 3, was there an overpayment or an underpayment? Code U for underpayment. If there was no improper payment here, it would have just been NA. The amount of the improper payment was $253, and the total payment amount for the sample month was $92. All right, so that's our first example. We made it through. Just going to take a breather for a minute. I don't see any questions or hands raised, but if you do have anything, please feel free to raise your hand right now or send in your question before I move on to our next example. All right, seeing no questions, I'll go ahead and move on to our next example. So as I stated at the beginning of the webinar, these next couple of examples, I'll move through them a bit quicker, just focusing on those elements that have an error, or those elements that had an error in example 1, but now have no error, so we can show how to complete them with no error. So if you recall, in the first example, element 100 had an error. In this example, this element 100 had no error. So we have yes down the line for the checkboxes. And I've, in the comments, described that the application was completed by 10/10/2017, and all of the required documents are included in the case file. So we have 0 and NA coded here. All right. Element 200 is going to be the same as last time with no error. Element 300 is also the same as last time with no error. So again, I'm going to kind of go through these a bit quickly for the sake of time, but if you would like me to slow down or go through one of these elements again, I'm happy to do so. Just let me know. 310 residency is going to be the same as last time with no error. We determined that the client is a resident of the state. 320 parental work training status, no error again. 330, no error again. 340, in our last example, there was an error. And so in this one, I'll just show how to complete this with when everything is correct. So I've just had a comment here that the full-time payment rate of $115 a week was assigned. And so everything looks good here, no error. And column 4 is coded as such. 350 is the same as in the last example. There's no error. But let's take a look at 400. So in this example, we found that the required income documentation was not all present in the case file. So at this point, and I have, for the sake of this example, filled out the rest of it. But this is an example where we've done the additional inquiry and the mid-table. So in the comments, I've said that the income information was missing from the case file. See mid-table for additional inquiry details. So I'm actually going to just quick skip this and go to the next slide where I have the example of the mid-table. And then I will come back to element 400 to see how it should be filled out. So again, this is the example of the mid-table. Since the error was found in element 400, that's the row we'll fill out. And I'm going to kind of extrapolate this element 400 row to the next slide just to make it easier to read. So to complete the mid-table, in column 2, describe what documentation was missing or insufficient. So in our example, as I've stated, the income information was missing from the case file. This would make the case totally ineligible in this state. Again, policies might differ from state to state, but here it would make the case ineligible. So we look at the amount of the payment to determine what that potential improper payment amount would be, and that's $345. Is there an additional inquiry that can be made to mitigate the potential improper payment error? So in our last webinar, hopefully most, if not all of you were on that, we discussed in detail the additional inquiry. So I'm not, for the sake of time, we're not going to spend a lot of time on what that entails. But in this example, yes, there is an additional inquiry that can be made. The reviewer determined that the family received SNAP benefits, so the reviewer contacted the SNAP office to locate the missing pay stubs. Yes, the improper payment was mitigated. That full payment amount was mitigated. And in the final column, we just describe how we determined whether or not the improper payment was mitigated. And it's because the SNAP office was able to provide the pay stubs with the income information. Okay. So I'm just going to go back to this slide, going back to element 400. So now that we have that missing payment information, we can go ahead and fill out the rest of the element. The total family income amount was $2660. Again, that's based on the information that was received from SNAP. We've determined that the family did meet the income threshold and that the correct parent fee was assigned. In the findings column, I mentioned that there was a potential improper payment error, but it was mitigated by the additional inquiry. So if you run into a case like this where you are doing the additional inquiry, what will happen is that you probably start completing the element, then you move on to the mid-table, and then you probably go back to the element to complete all of the coding. In column 4, I've coded that yes, there was an error. It was caused by missing or insufficient documentation. So since I have a Y here, I'll code 2A that yes, it was a potential improper payment error. Whenever there's Y coded in 2A, then the mid-table should be filled out. Okay. So again, we went through these slides already. This is the slides where I show the mid-table. Now this next slide is going back to the full mid-table. And I will show you here just completing that last row in the mid-table, the totals row. So here I show 400 as being completed. I just don't have all the words here for the sake of space. But once the mid-table has been completed in elements 100 through 400, then you will complete the totals row. And since in this example, there's only one row with an error, or only one row that's been completed, the totals row will just equal the same as the row in 400. So moving on to element 410. The eligibility worker subsidy amount was $345. And because we were able to mitigate that mid-error, we now know that the reviewer subsidy amount was correct. Or sorry, we know that the eligibility worker subsidy amount was correct. It matches the reviewer subsidy amount. I used the comments box here to kind of show my work, show the math, what the rate was, figure out what the monthly amount was, and the copay. And I note that the reviewer's calculation matches the eligibility workers. So there's no error here. And so in element 500, the case summary, in column 1, I mentioned that there is a potential improper payment error due to missing or insufficient documentation, and it was mitigated by the additional inquiry. And there's no errors in any other element. So here we do have an error. It was caused by missing or insufficient documentation. Again, just to backtrack for a minute, sorry, I didn't mention this. The mid-error was able to be mitigated. However, we still consider it to be an error, administrative error. So there's no improper payment error, it was mitigated, but there's still an administrative error because that income information was missing. And we will code 2A through 2E because the mid-table was used. And the items in 2A through 2E kind of match up with that the totals row in the mid-table. So there was one mid-error identified. $345 was the amount of the potential improper payment error. The additional inquiry was used one time, and it mitigated the potential improper payment error one time. $345 was mitigated due to using the additional inquiry. There was no improper payment, so the amount of improper payments is 0, and the total payment amount for the sample month was $345. I do have one more example that I want to quick show you. So this example is a little bit different because I'm showing a mid-error in element 100. Okay, so it's determined in the first item, is the application complete with the signature? No. You can see in the comments box, there are pages missing from the application, including the signature page. And in this state, according to this state's policy, these missing application pages would result in an improper payment. Okay, actually, I'm going to stop for a minute because I have a really good question that came in. And it's about element 100. So under element 100, there are 4 numbers under column 1. So we have application form, just show you what I'm talking about. We have application form, child care agreement, declaration of family assets, and voucher or certificate as applicable. The question is, all 4 items are not addressed here in column 2. Specifically, voucher is not addressed here. Is it necessary to address in column 4 all of the items that are in column 1? So the answer to this is yes, as applicable. So again, this is just a mock, a mock version of the record review worksheet. It's not based on, any real state's worksheet. So I did not include this number 4 voucher or certificate. Just in my example, I'm going to pretend that it's not applicable here. When all of you submitted your record review worksheets. This is something that we looked at for your customization. You know, was everything in column 1 either present here in column 2? And if not, is it because it's not necessarily applicable? Maybe, you know, it's folded in with one of the other items in column 2. So yeah, I mean, these items here are just examples of what might be required for the forms. So it's just not necessarily applicable in every state. You know, if we have any questions about it, you know, we'll certainly come back to you as we're going through the record review worksheet customization before it's approved. So hope that answers your question, Renee. Again, we can definitely talk about this after the webinar some more. Can everyone hear me okay? Sorry, I think I lost the sound for a moment. I apologize. So again, in this example, there was a mid-potential improper payment error in element 100. So we're going to take a look at the mid table for that element. The mid table is completed for any element that has a potential improper payment error due to missing or insufficient documentation, regardless of whether the additional inquiry was used. And this is going to be an example of that. Here we have pages that were missing from the application. In this state, according to their policies, that is going to be a total overpayment if it's missing. In column 4, we ask, is there an additional inquiry that can be made? And in this case, there isn't. Can't really get those missing childcare application pages from another source, at least not in this example. So we've coded column 4 as 0 and explained why in column 5. And we can skip column 6 through 9 because that's only completed if there was an additional inquiry. In this example, no other element had an error that was due to mid that might result in an improper payment. So we can go ahead and total this up in the bottom row. The dollar amount of the potential improper payment, $345. And no, there is no additional inquiry. All right, so I'm going to skip these next few elements since they're the same as in our previous examples. I'm going to stop for a moment at element 310. Client is a resident of example state. Yes, however, in the comments, the residency information was missing from the case file, but available in the system. So this is another example of something where things might be different from state to state. In some states, you know, if that residency information is not in the case file, that would be an overpayment, or it might not be an error at all, as long as it's in the system. In this example, in this state, it's considered an administrative error. The residency information was not in the case file, but it was available in the system. So taking another look at column 2, the comments are really helpful here in describing, excuse me, what the nature of the error was. If the reviewer would have just checked, yes, for that first item and left the comment section blank, we would have not had any information on what that error is. So this is where the comment section is really helpful to kind of expand or explain on why the box was checked, what documentation was reviewed, and explain what an error, if any, was. Moving to column 4, yes, there was an error and it was caused by missing or insufficient documentation. So we'll code 2A as N because this was not a potential improper payment error. This was only an administrative error. Okay, really quickly, I'm going to skip the next few elements since we've looked at them in the previous examples and these do not have any errors. In 410, it was determined that the eligibility worker subsidy amount was determined to be $345. However, because of that missing application that we talked about for element 100, it was not able to be mitigated by the additional inquiry. So the reviewer subsidy amount is 0. There's a $345 difference. And bringing in the sample month payment amount of $345, it's determined that there was an overpayment. So yes, there was an error. And yes, it was caused by missing or insufficient documentation. Again, those missing application pages. And then here's the comments box. The animation was a bit out of order. Improper payment error of $345 due to a missing application. Right, so the case summary. Again, we had a couple of errors in this element. There was the payment error of $345 due to the incomplete application. So I've cited elements 100 and 410 here. And then there was that administrative error, the missing residency information from 310. So moving over to column 2, yes, there was an error. It was caused by missing or insufficient documentation. We did have the mid-potential improper payment error of $345 identified, but we were unable to use the additional inquiry. We were not able to find that information elsewhere. So we're coding 0 for the next few items. For 3, there was an overpayment, so that's an O, not a 0. The improper payment amount was $345. And the total payment amount for the sample month was $345. Just a quick reminder, if there are multiple errors in a case file, you always code element 500 for the payment error. So for example, if in this case, the payment error was due to like a payment rate, as in our first example, but there was also a mid-error due to the missing residency that was just an administrative error, you would want to code 2 as N. So even though the case did have a mid-error due to that missing residency information, the payment error was due to the payment rate, which was not mid. And if you do have any, further questions on that, if you run into this in one of your reviews, feel free to reach out and we can provide some TA on that. All right, so we've made it through the hour. Thank you for the questions. They were all really good questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time to do our last example, which was going to be a more interactive example. But as you get started with your case reviews, we would love to do an interactive example with you one-on-one. So, feel free to reach out to your error rate specialist, and we'd love to talk more as you get started about this. This slide shows your error rate specialist. Leanne Bryan is the specialist for Region 1 in Puerto Rico. Janae Broadway is the error rate specialist for our friends in Region 7. And then any other region, you can email me if you have questions, concerns, or would like some follow-up TA. As we close out, there will be an evaluation that pops up. I hope this training was helpful for you. Again, this is something that is kind of new for us, so we do look forward to getting some feedback on it. Thanks so much again for joining us. I will stay on for a moment if any final questions come in, but otherwise, thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.